Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the development hosting of our Blazor app. How does it actually launch? What does it look like? What are our options? And how do we configure those options? Okay, so let's go into our Visual Studio and we'll create a new project, a Blazor app, and we'll call this Blazor app, and the solution name we'll call Dev Hosting Demo. Hit create. A Blazor server app. It's .NET Core 3.1 or ASP.NET Core 3.1. HTTPS is yes, but no authentication for now. And now we'll hit create. And this will create for us our standard project we've seen a few times now. But we've always just hit this play button, or actually chosen Kestrel, which I talked about briefly, and then hit the play button. But how does this actually work, and what are the options? Now again, I have this Azure Dev Spaces. Just ignore that. If you have some of the Azure stuff installed on your Visual Studio, you do get this option, which is to set up a dev space on Kubernetes, actually on Azure Kubernetes or AKS. So we're not going to do that or cover that. These are the two that are the important ones, IS Express and Blazor app. So how do they get configured, and what do we use them for? Why do we choose one over the other? So let's start with, where do you find the configuration for these? And that is in Properties. Either right click on your project and go to Properties, or double click on the Properties right here to get the Properties. And inside of here, we can come down here to Debug. And this is where all the debug stuff is configured. So notice first this profile, which is set to Blazor app, which just happens to correspond to what's up here because it's the same thing. That's where this up here gets its name. If we do a drop down, we see three different profiles: IS Express, Blazor app, and Azure Dev Spaces. In fact, let's click this one, which is the setup for AKS, and I can say, you know what, I don't want this one for this project, so I'll hit delete. Now it's gone, and it's no longer going to be in this list, or at least it shouldn't be. It'll get there once we hit save. There we go. Now it's gone. So we have two options now, IS Express or Blazor app. Let's look at the one I've been using first. This is the Kestrel version, which is where it launches that command window that has all the stuff going on, the logging information, and then it launches our web browser. So this launch is a project type. So that's going to be the Kestrel version versus IS Express or IS or Azure Dev Spaces, Snapshot Debugger Executable. Now, normally you don't have to configure any of this stuff, but I want to walk you through the different steps so that you can make tweaks to it if you really want to. Again, this is an in-depth course, so I really want to give you all the details possible so that you can really use this in a production environment with confidence. So this launch saying project, that's where we're configuring this, the Kestrel project. Now we could pass arguments in if you had arguments to pass in. We do not. The same as working directory. The working directory is set by default, so it's left blank. Again with launch browser. You don't have to launch the browser, but that's kind of defeats the purpose in some ways. Now, if we did not check this box, it would not launch the browser. Let's even do that. So I'm going to hit Launch Blazor App, and it's now running, but that's it. The browser hasn't launched. So I actually have to go and open a browser session. So let's go get a browser session, and then we'll bring it over. The environment variables is a place where you can set up environment variables. Seems kind of silly, but this actually has one variable in it that says ASP.NET Core _ environment is development. We're going to cover that in the next lesson when we talk about how to do error handling in our Visual Studio. But just note that in both the Blazor app and also IIS Express, there is that configuration for environment variable. All right, now down here, we have a couple of checkboxes which we're going to leave unchecked. Enable native code debugging, that'd be for debugging code that's not ours. And then SQL Server debugging as well, we don't need to do that either. But those options are there if we wanted them to be. Finally, for Kestrel, it's a very simple configuration. There's only basically two pieces of information. Inside the app URL, there is our HTTPS, and then with a semicolon between them, there's our HTTP version. So in theory, if you wanted to make a change, you could change one of these values here. Remember I said that Kestrel, by default, always uses port 5000 for the HTTP and always uses port 5001 for the HTTPS. So if you want to make that change so it's on a different port, you can do that right here. So that's Kestrel. Very simple to set up. It's just project and then put in our URLs for HTTP and HTTPS. And you're done. Let's look at IIS Express. IIS Express, the top half is the same, but down here under Web Server Settings, there's a few different ones. First of all, the app URL is an HTTP port, and it's a random port number. Again, you can change this if you would like, but this is going to be random for each of your projects. Now, once it's set, and it won't change unless you change it. But when your project first gets created, we get a different port number than the previous project you created. That way, you can have multiple of these running at the same time. IIS Express actually acts like a full IIS server, in that you can have it running in your system like. Only .NET Core is supported to be in process. So we cover the SSL, which we do want to have checked. And then there is the ability to enable anonymous authentication, meaning you don't have to be logged in order to authenticate, which seems like a catch-22. How do you authenticate if you're not logged in? Well, that's kind of the other checkbox here. If you're logged in or use Windows authentication, then whatever you're logged into on the machine, that can be your authentication. But we're going to allow anonymous authentication by default. We're not going to cover Windows authentication here, but if you have an Active Directory or an Azure AD, you can point that here and use some, configure a little bit, and then it will use that for your authentication system. Use the Azure AD or your Active Directory internally, and then it will know who your users are based upon their Windows credentials. All right, so those are the two profiles that are set up by default. If you wanted to, you could create a new profile. So this is where we set up the other half of IIS. In this case, the IIS Express settings say, hey, call IIS Express, launch the browser, and there's that environment variable, and then go ahead and use those IIS settings. What are they? Don't use Windows authentication, but do use anonymous authentication. And then the application URL, there it is right there, and the SSL port. Whereas for our other profile, which is Blazor app, that's the Kestrel app, we have all the settings and configuration all underneath that profile. We can even change the name here if you want. Remember back under properties, we didn't have a way to change these names. But if I decide, you know what, I don't want to call it Blazor app, I want to call it Kestrel. Like so. Now, the options are IIS Express and Kestrel. If I decided, you know what, I don't want the SSL port to be 44306, I want to match this. So let's say this is going to be 0880. Because normally your default HTTP port is port 80. And so we're going to say that it's 53080. Well, the normal port for SSL is 443. So let's say 53443. Kind of matches a little bit where we see the last three numbers are either the default SSL or the default HTTP, and we just put a 53 in front of them. So we can do that. We hit save, and now if we launch IIS Express, it's going to launch on port 53443. Notice there's our URL, and we actually have an error here. Isn't that awesome? So it's not working with this 53443 URL. Let's go back over here. I think the problem is that we're actually stepping on somebody's toes. So let's change this port number. Let's change it to 44300. Let's run this one. And this time it works just fine. Localhost 44300. So the port number we chose was one that I think is already running on my machine. And that's something that Visual Studio does for you, is it looks for those ports. But since I'm doing it manually, I can kind of step on toes. You cannot have two things listening on the same port. You can cause some problems. So the kind of moral of the story here is, if it doesn't really matter, then don't change the ports, because it's going to create some problems that you might have to work around. But if you need to, and you have these problems, just note that the reason why is probably because you're stepping on somebody's toes. And you can play around here and say, you know what, maybe I want to make this into 8000. So it's 80, so 8,000 essentially, but add 2 zeros, whatever number is a standard. So the standard is 80, so 8,000. The standard is 443, so 44,300. Let's try that. And that might work for this project, we'll see. And it does. Now, if we do HTTP : and then do localhost and then :8000, it's going to redirect right to this page. So that does work, and it does look like we've got a setup that is configured the way we want it to be. So you can change these values if you want to, but if you don't, just know that that's where they're at, and you can make other tweaks in this file as well. So for example, like we changed the name to Kestrel instead of the name of the project. That might work for you in some projects, and if it does, great. But if you don't have to change that, leave it at the default, because then new developers coming in will understand what it is. But again, it's up to you. This might add a little more clarity to your project, in which case, go for it. But all the settings are in here for you to tweak if you so desire. Now, when you launch your application, regardless of which way you launch your application, we can look at this output window and notice there's a bunch of stuff going on in this window. Most of it scrolls off the page. But if we, and it also scrolls down, but notice in here that there's a bunch of information about the when you first start off about what's loading that you really probably don't care about, but at least you know it's here and you can look for more information about what's going on with your web host. Notice again, if you change to your Kestrel launch and launch, you'll still see output at that output window like so. And notice again, it's blazor.exe. You do see a little bit more information about from logging where it's listening to. So it's listening to those two ports, and what the hosting environment is. Again, we're going to cover that variable very soon. So either way, the output window does give you a lot of good information. Again, I personally choose to use Kestrel, so I can see this window, which because of logging and how it's set up, it kind of shrinks down what I see just to what I am interested in. Anything that is logged gets shown here unless it's been filtered out. And we'll cover filtering and logging in an upcoming video. So that's it for this lesson. We've covered how our hosts are set up. So these two right here. Right now it's IS Express and Kestrel. Normally it says Blazor app here, but we renamed that. So we covered these two, how they're configured, and how to either go into the properties and debug in order to make the changes to our hosting profiles, or under launch settings.json to change it manually. All right. Now, there is the concept of browser linking and configuring that, but it's not great for Blazor server side. And so we're not going to do browser link because right now it doesn't really work the way you'd expect it to, because it's a single page application. And with single page applications, if you refresh the page, then what happens is it resets everything. And so it doesn't work really well in that way, but we'll still be able to do a full rich debugging experience. It's just that the development experience isn't quite the same as what we get in a Razor Pages, where we can do our browser link to have the page automatically refreshed as we make changes and save them. So just note that's why we're not going to cover browser link as part of this, because that doesn't apply to Blazor server. At least not in a meaningful way at this point. It may in the future. So now that we've covered development hosting, it's time for you to practice what you learned in this video. So make sure that you practice creating these, making changes, seeing how it works, breaking it, fixing it, so you know how to set up your development environment to be ideally optimized for what you're doing. Once you're done, then come on back to the next lesson.